Disgusting hygiene habits in history that have us running for the shower. Bathing came to be seen as a self-indulgent luxury, hence sinful. In medieval Europe, from the Iberian Peninsula to the beginning of the Russian steppes, towns and larger communities typically emerged alongside rivers and streams. As communities grew, the freely running water became supplemented by wells and cisterns, the latter to capture rainwater and store it for another day. Rain barrels in towns answered a similar purpose, but only in the homes of the wealthiest, and in the monasteries, which in the medieval period were often the same thing, was there anything resembling running fresh water. For anyone else, water had to be carried from the source to the home. Most homes, even the most humble, maintained a wash basin for the purpose of cleansing hands and face in the morning and before meals. Few used the precious liquid for anything else, except during special days set aside for the purpose of washing clothes and bodies. 6 days of the week were for labor. Taking time off for the wasteful luxury of soaking one's lazy body in warm water was sinful. On the 7th day, the carrying of water, gathering of firewood, and act of heating and dispensing water for the purpose of lolling in it was a violation of the Sabbath. It was enough that clothes were washed on the day of the week assigned for the purpose. Since relatively few had more than one suit of outer clothes, it was usually only undergarments, called small clothes, which were exposed to hot water and harsh soap. Bathing of the body was unheard of in winter, and often looked upon with considerable suspicion in the warmer months. The results were predictable. Bodies odoriferous from their own sweat, crawling with lice, fleas, and skin disorders were the rule, from the most humble abode to the royal palaces. North American natives had their own hygienic rituals and practices. In pre-Columbian North America, from what is now Mexico into the northern woods of modern-day Canada, Native Americans followed hygienic routines both religious and practical. Sweat lodges were used as primitive saunas, not too unlike the modern equivalent. Herbs and plants were distributed among rocks heated in the fires, fresh water poured over them, and the resultant steam and herbal diffusion enjoyed as both a purgative and cleansing ritual. After the steam bath, a dip in a nearby stream or lake, or water from same poured over the body, completed the ritual. However, the bather did not stay clean for long. Natives dealt with malicious critters, particularly during the warm months. Mosquitoes, fleas, no-see-ums, black flies, deer flies, and a plethora of other pests tormented their bodies, no matter how clean they were. The natives combated the critters with animal fat. From several large game animals, but prevalently from the black bear, the natives created a lard rendered from the fat of the animal. This grease, with which they covered their bodies and hair, protected them to some extent from bites and stings, but it also went rancid quickly, especially in the summer heat, lending them an aroma which was surely none too pleasant. Many references among European colonizers to the unpleasant smell of the natives, which eventually led to racial stereotypes, stemmed from the practice of coating themselves with rancid bear.
Practice of coating themselves with rancid bear grease. Buffalo was another source for grease, no doubt equally unpleasant. While trailblazers such as Daniel Boone, David Crockett, Simon Kenton, and others adopted the practice during their extended periods in the woods, they spoke disparagingly of it upon their return to the settlements. Their unbathed neighbors and friends were disgusted by their reports. Cleanliness was a challenge even in the monasteries. In the early days of the medieval period, the monasteries represented the highest levels of human achievement in the fields of publishing, philosophy, science, agriculture, medicine, and mechanics. Yet even in the monasteries, personal hygiene was difficult to achieve. In most, bathing of the entire body was limited to 2 or 3 times per year. Personal cleanliness was supported by the provision of wash basins in which the good brothers would wash their hands and faces prior to meeting for their communal meals. The monasteries provided the water in the basins and, to ensure cleanliness, made sure it was changed at least once per week. No doubt, washing one's face in water, which had previously been used by countless brothers just before enjoying one's breakfast, was an invigorating experience. Most monasteries also thoughtfully provided towels. From these and other arrangements, such as in the palaces and houses of the more well-to-do, it is evident that washing with water was not looked upon with disdain. People knew to wash, especially removing the day's grime from their hands prior to enjoying their meals. They just didn't know how to do it. The removal of grime could be confirmed visually. The removal of pathogens, which were at any rate wholly unknown, could not. Washing in water previously used by others for the same purpose was nonetheless still washing, and the cleansed hands could be presented at table without shame. They were used to extract victuals from the communal pot without concern of spreading disease. After all, the absence of visible dirt meant the hands were clean, fulfilling at least a small part of the unwritten social contract among civilized people. Most medieval baths were actually showers of sorts. Fuel to heat water for baths was expensive, in more ways than one. In cities and larger towns, it had to be purchased from woodcutters. In smaller towns and isolated communities, it had to be cut, split, gathered, and stacked. One method took cash or barter, the other an investment in time. To apply such an investment to the heating of water for the purpose of taking a bath was deemed a luxury. Using enough hot water, heated with expensive firewood, to allow full immersion in a tub was an extravagance bordering on waste. Instead, most baths involved standing in a receptacle to catch water poured over one's head from buckets or pitchers. Saving the water allowed it to be reused. Waste not, want not. In families with a single tub, the male head of the household bathed first, followed by the other males of the household. The matron of the house followed the procession of males, after which daughters were bathed, based on their seniority. Thus, the last to be bathed was laved with water, which had previously cleansed the bodies of parents and siblings. Only toddlers and infants were immersed. Their older siblings were simply rinsed with increasingly dirty water. The youngest being bathed last is the source of the remonstrance not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Nobles and the wealthy had their own bathing rituals and procedures which reflected their higher status. There is a reason the so-called common people have long been known disparagingly as the Great Unwashed. Bathing usually took place in early summer and again in the late fall following the harvest, when all enjoyed their baths whether they needed them or not. Soap, being expensive and often reserved for laundry, was optional. The use of a toilet was often considered optional. In the great houses of the medieval ages, nooks and closets designed to house chamber pots were not uncommon. In the early days of the period, some even had running water, which flowed to cesspools outside the walls. Many considered their use optional, especially when one needed merely to urinate. Dark corners, empty fireplaces behind tapestries and curtains were all acceptable options, particularly among the gentlemen present. Retreating to a hidden closet temporarily removed oneself from the game at hand. The discussion of the hunt, the argument over politics, the convivial bowl, and the feminine company allowed in for the occasion. That is not to say the use of the privy chamber was more frequent when not entertaining guests. Master and mistress, as well as their immediate servants, frequently answered calls to nature wherever nature found them when it presented the urge. In less affluent homes, the chamber pot was frequently ignored as well. Emptying and cleaning the convenience was frequently inconvenient, as in times of inclement weather. The fireplace offered a warmer alternative in the winter months especially. The use of privies improved as the medieval age advanced. However, throughout the period and well into the Age of Reason, the use of unintended spaces to take one's ease indoors was common. Bodies were often covered in vermin. For the average individual of the medieval period and ensuing centuries, life was a lousy proposition, literally. Vermin shared the residences, the bedding, the clothing, and the bodies of the people. Scalps crawled with lice and fleas. Beds, mostly made of straw ticking, were liberally occupied with those creatures, as well as others, including bedbugs. The more crowded the quarters, the greater the vermin population. Servants' quarters in the great houses, where people were crowded together like olives in a jar, provided fertile breeding grounds for all forms of crawling pests, all anxiously awaiting an opportunity to ingest human blood. The curse of pestilence was not limited to the medieval age. It continued for centuries beyond that period. When George Washington, as a youth, wrote his rules of civility, he addressed, at least in a sideways manner, the ubiquitous presence of vermin. Washington was not the author of the 110 Rules of Civility today attributed to him. He copied them from a Jesuit text written in the 16th century. Among them, George dutifully reproduced 13. Kill no vermin, as fleas, lice, ticks, etc., in the sight of others. The obvious inference to be taken is that the presence of vermin was so common that one should not draw attention to it. They were simply an accepted fact of life. In the absence of disinfectants and strong soaps and the infrequency of bathing and washing of clothes, there was simply no way to get rid of them. When watching films featuring the revealing gowns of the 8th and 18th century, it is difficult to imagine the wearer crawling with lice. But the character being represented most likely was. Attempts at personal cleanliness were nonetheless known in the medieval world. Study of manuscripts and documents from the medieval period, particularly from the monasteries, are often cited as evidence of the somewhat lax hygienic practices of the day. Yet medieval monasteries have yielded written instructions regarding the washing of hands and faces prior to and following meals. To some, the written requirements to wash hands, personal hygiene at its most basic, offers evidence that the people of the day, even those considered more educated, needed to be instructed regarding hygiene. Many of the monasteries had separate rooms for the pre-dinner washing called lavatoria. They, it should be noted, were separate from the rooms intended for relieving oneself called latrines and privies. It was in the lavatoria written instructions on washing of the hands has been found. Consider that in terms of the present day. Written instructions regarding hand washing are commonplace in modern society. Enter virtually any public restroom and such instructions can be found, many with illustrations to serve as guides for those who find reading simple English a challenge. In restaurants, there is usually another sign mandating employees wash their hands before returning to work. Surely an archaeologist of the 23rd century, exploring the artifacts of the 24 site, will observe such relics and ponder their meaning, perhaps assuming that 21st century humanity practiced questionable hygiene, though the presence of sinks, running water, and other trappings will create a paradox. They had the means, but needed guidance. Most curious. The same consideration must be applied when judging the hygienic practice of our collective forebears. One can't imagine it was more pleasant to be infested with lice and fleas in the medieval age than it is today. Surely, they must have tried to do something about it. But what? The groom of the stool. The holder of the title. Groom of the stool held a job which placed him in close intimacy with his king. A largely British title which evolved under the Tudors, the groom of the stool was a position required only when the monarch was a male. His job was to remain in close proximity to the king until His Majesty determined his services were needed. At that time, The groom approached his monarch bearing a small stool with an open seat. Within, beneath the seat, was affixed a chamber pot or other receptacle. Beneath the receptacle, safely stowed until needed, were rags, towels, water, and any other accoutrements favored by the king for cleaning up after relieving himself through defecation. The groom then assisted his king in whatever manner necessary before disposing of the results of the king's efforts. It should be noted that the word stool of the title refers to the device carried about by the titular groom, and not the organic matter deposited by His Majesty therein. Nor was the position looked down upon, as one may infer from its duties. Far from it. It became a position of considerable influence under Henry VIII. By the 18th century, the holder of the title also held numerous other high responsibilities, including assisting the king in dressing in the morning, and he held sway over other servants of the bedchamber. Many grooms of the stool were peers of the realm, bearing the titles and styles of Marquess, Viscount, Earl, and Duke. John Stuart, who served as George III's first groom of the stool, was 3rd Earl of Bute and eventually Prime Minister of Great Britain. Evidently, it was a job with a future. Personal hygiene evolved rapidly at sea. During the age of sail sea voyages were long affairs, with large crews packed into crowded conditions for months and even years. Also, during the age of sail, captains noticed an interesting phenomena. The longer they were separated from the shore, the healthier their crews became, with the exception of scurvy, not yet understood to be preventable through consumption of fresh vegetables and fruit. Captains at sea ride their ships of vermin by smoking them out, of rats and mice by entrapment, and the use of cats and dogs as predators. And their men, exposed to the weather, were cleaner than their counterparts ashore. So were their living quarters, as captains strove more and more to enhance discipline through enforced cleanliness. A month or so at sea and colds and influenza vanished from the ship. Crews found themselves bathed by fresh water from rain and salt water from rough seas. Captains began the practice of airing out bedding, as well as clothes, allowing fresh air and sunshine to do its work on formerly damp blankets and trousers. Sailors relieved themselves over the side, and there were no festering latrines to draw flies and other pestilence. Upon entering port, sailors quickly availed themselves of the usually unhygienic pleasures available ashore, and once back at sea, a shaking-out period was often necessary before the ship, and the sailors aboard it were once again clean. But they soon were. Medical professionals, such as there were at the time, took note of the health of the sailors, and for the professionals, such as there were at the time, took note of the health of the sailors, and for the first time, the benefits of salt air became a subject of debate. Shaving is an overlooked aspect of the history of hygiene. As a procedure in the pursuit of personal hygiene, shaving has remained more or less unchanged since primitive man used sharpened rocks to scrape away unwanted facial hair. As unpleasant as that sounds, it was nonetheless an improvement. Evidence that primitive man removed facial hair by plucking has been found, meaning that primitive man was willing to forego considerable pain in pursuit of hirsute style. Native Americans also plucked facial and body hair, as well as the scalp, in order to obtain the tuft of longer hair known to posterity as the scalp lock, a sign of adulthood and a potential trophy for enemies. While plucking has thankfully gone out of fashion, the removal of unwanted hair by scraping with a sharpened instrument remains the basis of shaving today. Even electric shavers, no matter how advanced, rely on a blade clipping the follicle without damaging the skin. The question is why? There are cave drawings depicting men sans facial hair indicating the desire for a close shave over 30,000 years old. In some societies, full beards became the norm. In others, smooth chins predominated. Some were cyclical. Review of photographs from the Victorian age indicates full beards were fashionable, even the norm, at least among the more affluent. Full stomachs too, but that is a different matter. In ancient Egypt, where razors manufactured from copper appeared around 3000 BCE, men removed their beards, and then some, usually those of noble birth, replaced them with fake ones, a symbol of their divine nature. The ancient Romans encountered bearded enemies and responded by shaving their own faces, citing superior cleanliness as one reason. Beards harbored lice. Vermin-infested enemies were obviously inferior in Roman thought. Dental hygiene evolved slowly over the centuries.
Frequently,
In a
a
world
means
where
to hide
daily
the neck
cleansing
area
of the
evolved.
body was uncommon
The neck
and
cloth,
even looked
often
at with
decorated
suspicion,
with a
it
lacy
should come
front
as no
descending from
surprise
throat to
most
chest,
people
covered the
were
less than
negligent
presentable state
regarding
of the
cleaning of the
undershirt's
teeth and
collar.
gums.
Much
As a
later,
result,
the detachable
dental problems
collar,
prevailed.
at first made of starched
Ancient
linen and
Sumerian
later of
texts
celluloid,
contain
served a
references to
similar
dental
purpose.
problems, including
Gentlemen
toothaches
presented their
and
linen
loss of
as
teeth.
the visible portion of
They believed
the
the
neck
teeth
cloth came to
were
be
under
called as
continuous
decorative
assault
and
by
a sign of
toothworms.
cleanliness, no matter how grimy
Combating
was the
said
collar the
worms
neck cloth
was a
served to
source of
obscure.
concern.
When
While
viewing the
that does
founding
not present
fathers
the
in their
modern
finery,
imagination
it is interesting
with an
to reflect
attractive
that it
mental
is
image to
concealing and
ponder,
unpresentable,
it
grime
does
streaked
indicate
collar under all that lace.
concern over the condition of the mouth was present in ancient times. Little was done in the matter of protecting the teeth other than by fortuitous accident. For example, forensic evidence indicates some ancient Roman citizens had healthier teeth than most of their contemporaries around the empire. Examination of preserved corpses from the ruins of Pompeii confirms the Romans, despite lacking even the most basic implements for the care of teeth, had remarkably little tooth decay. Modern science attributes this phenomenon to the lack of refined sugar in the Roman diet. Pompeians may have had relatively healthy teeth, though it cannot be attributed to an adherence to dental hygiene. Dental hygiene in the ancient world was universally poor, nearly non-existent, though the art of dentistry, that is, extraction and even filling of decayed teeth, developed in several cultures. So did numbing of the affected region among those suffering from toothache. The Aztecs alleviated toothache pain by chewing on coca leaves. Centuries later, pharmaceutical cocaine was an accepted analgesic used by dentists on their patients. Personal hygiene historically affected relationships among peers. Among the Europeans beginning in the medieval period and continuing well into the 1st century, it was widely believed that undergarments, usually made of either linen or wool, served to cleanse the body of the wearer. The impurities transferred to the undergarments during the day were transferred in turn to the bedding during the night. Airing the bedding sent them on their way. Sleeping fully clothed prevented this transfer of grime and was thus considered as immoral as sleeping clothed in nothing at all. Gradually, nightshirts came to be considered the proper dress for bed, though they were typically worn over the undergarments worn during the day. Benjamin Franklin scandalized John Adams when he first took an air bath, sitting naked before an open window before donning his nightshirt alone and retiring to bed. Franklin came to consider his air baths essential to his good health. Because the undergarments were not washed with frequency, they quickly became discolored. Those areas which showed, especially around the neck, were available for public viewing and therefore public judgments. Rather than changing the underwear or washing it more frequently, a means to hide the neck area evolved. The neckcloth, often decorated with a lacy front descending from throat to chest, covered the less than presentable state of the undershirt's collar. Much later, the detachable collar, at first made of starched linen and later of celluloid, served a similar purpose. Gentlemen presented their linen, as the visible portion of the neckcloth came to be called, as decorative and a sign of cleanliness. No matter how grimy was the collar, the neckcloth served to obscure. When viewing the Founding Fathers in their finery, it is interesting to reflect that each is concealing an unpresentable, grime-streaked collar under all that lace.